What if the US map didn't look the way it does now? What if some states, tired of Washington's politics or drawn to a different way of life, decided to break away and not just to form their own country, but to join another? As wild as it sounds, some US states already share deep economic, cultural, and political ties with Canada. From cross-border trade to shared lifestyles, the connection runs deeper than most people realize. Today, we're looking at 10 US states that, if things ever fell apart, might just find their future not in DC, but in Ottawa. Vermont might seem like an unlikely candidate for secession. Quiet, peaceful, full of maple trees and charming small towns. But dig a little deeper and you'll find a fierce independent streak. Before it became the 14th state in 1791, Vermont was a republic, completely separate from the original 13 colonies. Today, that spirit lingers. The Second Vermont Republic movement still advocates for secession, arguing the state would be better off on its own, or even as part of Canada. Vermont's progressive politics closely mirror Quebec's, and its economy, from maple syrup to tourism, already aligns with Canadian markets. With strong trade ties and shared social values, Vermont might not be as firmly rooted in the US as it seems. Maine sits at the northeastern edge of the US, but in many ways, it already lives like Canada's neighbor because it is. The state depends heavily on electricity imported from Quebec, and over $3 billion in goods cross its northern border each year. Maine's rugged coastline, fishing towns, and French-speaking communities feel culturally closer to New Brunswick than to New York. Even politically, Maine has shown tendencies that align more with Canadian social policies than American conservatism. It was once part of Massachusetts before it split off to become its own state. Who's to say it couldn't change course again? If national politics ever pushed too far from its values, Maine might not find Canada such a foreign option. New Hampshire is known for its motto, "Live free or die," but what if that commitment to independence went further than anyone expected? This small New England state has long resisted federal control, with no income or sales tax and a deeply rooted libertarian culture. In 2022, a group of lawmakers even proposed a constitutional amendment that would have let voters decide whether the state should leave the US. It didn't pass, but the fact that it made it to the floor says a lot. Economically, New Hampshire trades billions with Canada every year, and culturally, its rural lifestyle and emphasis on local governance often feel more in line with Canadian provinces than the federal-heavy US system. Minnesota and Canada share more than just a long border. They share an identity. From the accent to the love of hockey, from the frigid winters to a progressive political streak, Minnesotans and Canadians often feel like cousins. Canada is Minnesota's largest trading partner with over $7 billion in exports in 2023 alone. Historically, parts of Minnesota were once governed by the British, and the state's fur trade was tightly linked with Canadian commerce. Today, dual citizenship and cross-border family ties are common in northern Minnesota. If the US were ever to fracture or face deep internal conflict, Minnesota, with its Canadian cultural overlap and strong economic ties, might be among the first to consider its northern neighbor as a real alternative. Quiet and often overlooked, North Dakota might seem firmly planted in the American heartland, but its economic lifeline says otherwise. The state exports more goods to Canada than to any other country, around $6 billion a year, and depends on Canadian energy, agriculture partnerships, and even healthcare. In many border towns, seeing Canadian license plates is a daily norm. Politically, North Dakota's small government, pro-business approach aligns closely with Canadian prairie provinces like Alberta. There was even a historical moment when a North Dakota-Manitoba economic union was seriously discussed. That idea faded, but the economic logic behind it remains. If the US ever faced a crisis that strained national unity, North Dakota might find it more practical to look north than to stay loyal to a distant federal government. Montana is often called Big Sky Country, a place known for wide-open landscapes and rugged independence. But what if that very independence made it look north? Montana shares a 545-mile border with 3 Canadian provinces, British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and has deep cultural and economic connections with them. In 2023, it exported over $700 million in goods to Canada. Residents on both sides of the border share a love for ranching, hunting, and enduring brutal winters. Historically, Montana's early fur trade was dominated by Canadian companies. And politically, many Montanans feel distant from Washington, D.C., frustrated by federal oversight and drawn to systems that prioritize local control. If tensions ever escalated nationally, Montana might not hesitate to explore a path that leads to closer alignment with Canada. Washington state may be part of the U.S. Pacific Northwest, but its heart beats in rhythm with British Columbia. In 2023 alone, Washington and Canada exchanged over $20 billion in goods, and Vancouver and Seattle feel more like sister cities than separate nations. Hydroelectric power from British Columbia supplies parts of Washington's grid, and the two regions have proposed infrastructure projects like a high-speed rail to link them more closely. Politically, Washington's progressive policies on healthcare, climate change, and social issues are often more in step with Canada than the U.S. federal government. For many residents, the idea of becoming more integrated with Canada doesn't feel far-fetched. It feels like a logical evolution of a relationship that already runs deep. Oregon has always had a bit of a rebellious streak, but lately that energy has taken on a new form. Deep divisions within the state have led some eastern counties to push for joining Idaho, but others in the west whisper a different idea. Why not join Canada instead? Culturally, cities like Portland mirror Vancouver more than they do any major American city, especially in values like environmental protection, universal healthcare, and workers' rights. Oregon trades over $4 billion annually with Canada, and its economic structure shares key similarities with British Columbia's. If political gridlock and ideological clashes in the U.S. continue, Western Oregon's alignment with Canadian ideals might make the northern border feel less like a line and more like a door. Alaska is already physically detached from the rest of the United States. You have to drive through Canada just to get there. But that's not the only reason this state feels closer to its northern neighbor. Alaska's economy is deeply linked to Canada through the oil, mining, and seafood industries, with many operations crossing the border or depending on Canadian investment. Its military presence also intersects with Canada via NORAD, a joint defense agreement that integrates U.S. and Canadian forces. Culturally and economically, Alaskans have long worked with Canadians on northern survival, resource extraction, and indigenous issues. If the U.S. ever experienced serious national instability, Alaska, remote, self-reliant, and already half-integrated with Canada, could see secession not as a rupture, but as a return to natural alignment. No U.S. state is more economically intertwined with Canada than Michigan. The Detroit-Windsor border is one of the busiest trade crossings in North America, with over $80 billion in goods moving annually. The auto industry, Michigan's lifeblood, relies on seamless coordination between factories in both countries. Cars assembled in Michigan often include parts made in Canada and vice versa. The two regions share energy grids, water systems, and transportation infrastructure. Historically, some Michiganders even floated the idea of joining Canada after the 1835 Toledo War. Today, with overlapping economies and aligned social values in urban areas like Detroit and Windsor, the concept may sound radical, but it's grounded in decades of connection. If any state is already living like a Canadian province, it's Michigan. At first glance, the idea of American states breaking away and joining Canada might sound like fiction. But when you examine the cultural, economic, and political ties, the picture becomes less far-fetched. From shared industries and regional identities to movements for greater autonomy, these 10 states already have one foot across the border. In times of political division or national crisis, history has shown that borders can shift and nations can change. The question isn't just whether it could happen, it's whether, in some ways, it already has.